Bergsville was the epitome of small-town America. Nestled deep in the heartland, with its quiet streets and tree-lined avenues, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The town boasted a population of just under 5,000, and most families had lived there for generations. For the residents of Bergsville, life moved at a slower pace. The town itself had a timeless quality. Its old-fashioned brick buildings, the corner diner where the same waitress had worked for 20 years, and the local general store where people still kept accounts by hand. It was the kind of town where the loudest event of the year was the county fair, and the biggest scandal was when the high school football team lost a game. In Bergsville, trust was a given, not something you earned. People left their doors unlocked, neighbors greeted each other warmly on the street, and children rode their bikes freely through the town without a care in the world. Crime? Almost unheard of. If someone lost their wallet, it was always returned, and the most the local police had to deal with were the occasional parking violations or teens getting a little too rowdy at the annual summer carnival. But all of that changed in the spring of 2010. On the morning of May 6th, the tranquility that had defined Bergsville for decades was shattered. Jessica Michaels, a well-known and much-loved 25-year-old resident, disappeared without a trace. The suddenness of it left the town reeling. For a place that prided itself on safety and simplicity, the idea that one of their own could simply vanish was unthinkable. Jessica was no stranger to the people of Bergsville. She had grown up there, attended the local high school, and worked at Page Turner's, the town's only bookstore. She had lived alone in a small, modest apartment not far from the town square, and by all accounts, her life was uneventful, predictable even. She was the kind of person people trusted, reliable, kind, and hardworking. Her parents, Mary and John Michaels, were pillars of the community. John had worked at the local post office for 30 years, and Mary was a volunteer at the town's church. May 5th had been like any other day for Jessica. She arrived at work just before 9 a.m., greeted her coworkers with her usual warm smile, and spent the day helping customers, organizing new arrivals, and chatting with familiar faces. The day passed without incident. The shop closed at 7 p.m., and Jessica stayed a bit later than usual to finish some paperwork. She locked up the store around 8 p.m. and began the short walk to her car, parked just 2 blocks away on a well-lit street. It was the last time anyone saw her. When Jessica didn't show up for work the next morning, her co-workers at Page Turner's grew concerned. Jessica was known for her punctuality, always arriving on time and never missing a shift without warning. At first, they thought she might be running late, but as the hours ticked by, worry began to creep in. By noon, they were calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail every time. Jessica's friends tried to reach her parents, but they hadn't heard from her either. By 2 p.m., panic had set in. Jessica's parents, Mary and John, immediately drove to her apartment. They knocked on the door, called her name, but received no response. When they let themselves in using the spare key Jessica had given them, everything appeared normal. Her bed was neatly made, her work clothes from the previous day were still folded on a chair, and nothing seemed out of place. The only thing missing was Jessica herself. That's when they called the police. Detective Thomas Graham, a veteran of the Bergsville Police Department, arrived at the scene within the hour. Graham was a seasoned officer, known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts. He had seen his fair share of incidents over the years, but never anything like this. Missing persons cases were unheard of in Bergsville, and the fact that it was Jessica, a beloved member of the community, only heightened the sense of urgency. The investigation began immediately. Graham started by retracing Jessica's steps from the previous evening. Her car was found parked where she had left it, just a few blocks from the bookstore. It was locked, and inside were her purse, phone, and a half-empty cup of coffee. The discovery of her untouched belongings raised more questions than answers. Why would she leave her things behind? If she had been taken, why were there no signs of a struggle? Graham and his team canvassed the area, speaking to neighbors and anyone who might have seen something that night. But no one had noticed anything unusual. The streets had been quiet, as they always were. No witnesses, no strange cars, no sounds of a struggle. It was as if Jessica had vanished into thin air. The first 48 hours were critical in any missing persons case, and Graham knew it. The search was intensified. Flyers with Jessica's face were posted on every lamppost and in every shop window. The local news ran continuous updates on her disappearance, and soon the entire town was on edge. The disappearance of Jessica Michaels sent shockwaves through Bergsville. For the first time in decades, the residents of the town felt vulnerable. People who had once left their doors unlocked at night began double-checking the locks and closing their blinds. Parents kept a closer watch on their children, and neighbors who had always trusted each other now exchanged suspicious glances. The community rallied together in an unprecedented show of solidarity. Volunteers from every corner of Bergsville joined the search for Jessica. They combed through the nearby woods, fields, and abandoned buildings, hoping to find any trace of her. Search dogs were brought in, and helicopters scanned the area from above, but the efforts yielded nothing. Jessica was simply gone. Her parents were devastated. Mary Michaels could barely hold herself together, her voice cracking every time she spoke to the press, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. John Michaels, usually the strong, silent type, was barely able to contain his frustration with the lack of progress in the investigation. As the days passed, hope began to fade. The police had no leads, and despite the tireless efforts of the community, there were no new clues. The longer Jessica remained missing, the more the fear grew that she might never be found. But Detective Graham refused to give up. 2 weeks had passed since Jessica's disappearance, and hope was beginning to fade in Bergsville. Search teams returned empty-handed day after day. The community was growing weary, and the initial shock was slowly transforming into a resigned acceptance. But not for Detective Thomas Graham. He had seen too many cases where the smallest detail could break the investigation wide open. He wasn't ready to give up yet. He decided to dig deeper into Jessica's life, searching for anything they might have missed. On the surface, Jessica's life had seemed simple and ordinary. She worked at Page Turner's for the past 2 years, but before that, she had worked at the local bank. Something about that job change piqued Graham's curiosity, so he decided to start there. Graham visited the bank and spoke with Jessica's former manager, Jeff Whitmore. Whitmore remembered Jessica as a reliable, meticulous employee. She was good at her job, maybe too good, he said, nervously tapping a pen against the desk. But she left because of stress. Toward the end, she got caught up in an investigation we had here. It was about some missing funds from clients' accounts. Jessica had been involved in uncovering a discrepancy in the bank's accounts. Small amounts of money had been disappearing over a period of months, and Jessica had been the one to notice the pattern. Whitmore assured Graham that the bank had conducted a thorough internal audit and concluded that it was likely just a clerical error. But Jessica hadn't been so sure. According to her coworkers, she had become increasingly stressed and anxious in the months leading up to her resignation. She thought something more was going on, Whitmore admitted, but we couldn't find any evidence of foul play. After the audit, the issue was closed. Graham, however, wasn't convinced. He requested access to the bank's records from that investigation. At first, the bank's management resisted, insisting that the case had been thoroughly reviewed and nothing suspicious had been found. But Graham persisted, and eventually the records were handed over. Graham spent hours reviewing the financial records from the bank. As he traced the movement of funds, a disturbing pattern emerged. The amounts that had disappeared weren't random. They had been carefully siphoned off and transferred to offshore accounts through a series of small, seemingly insignificant transactions. It wasn't a clerical error. It was embezzlement. The more he uncovered, the more it became clear that Jessica had stumbled upon something much bigger than she had realized. Graham began to suspect that whoever was behind the missing funds had realized that Jessica was onto them. Had they silenced her to protect their secret? But it wasn't just the missing money. Graham also discovered that Rick Lawson, the mysterious man from the bookstore, had an account at the bank. His account had been flagged during the internal investigation as part of the money laundering scheme. The connection between Lawson and Jessica was suddenly much more significant than just a chance meeting at the bookstore. Rick Lawson, as it turned out, wasn't just a drifter. He had ties to a much larger criminal organization. Graham was starting to piece together a disturbing narrative. Jessica had uncovered a money laundering operation at the bank, and someone within that network had realized she was a threat. With this new information, Graham brought Rick Lawson in for questioning once again. This time, he had more leverage. He knew Lawson's account was tied to the missing funds, and he wasn't about to let him wriggle out of it. "Why don't you tell me why you've been hanging around Jessica's bookstore for the past few weeks?" Graham asked, his voice calm but firm. Lawson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact. "I told you, I didn't know her. I just went in there a couple of times. I like to read." "Sure you do," Graham replied dryly, flipping through the financial records in front of him. "And I suppose you have no idea why your account at the bank was flagged in an investigation for suspicious activity?" Lawson's face tightened, but he said nothing. Graham pressed on, laying out the connections between Lawson's account and the offshore transactions. The more he talked, the more Lawson's demeanor shifted, from evasive to outright nervous. "I didn't do anything wrong," Lawson finally blurted. "I didn't hurt her." "You didn't hurt her? But you know who did, don't you?" Graham's voice was sharp now. He was getting close, and Lawson knew it. Lawson's silence spoke volumes. He refused to answer any more questions, and without hard evidence to hold him, Graham was forced to let him go for now. But he knew he was on the right track. Lawson was involved, whether directly or indirectly, and Graham was determined to prove it. While Graham focused on Lawson, the town of Bergsville was struggling to come to terms with Jessica's disappearance. Her parents were inconsolable. Mary Michaels spent every waking moment putting up more flyers, organizing vigils, and pleading with anyone who might have information. Her husband, John, who had always been the strong, silent type, was beginning to lose hope. The town's residents, once united in their search, began to grow fearful. The idea that one of their own could vanish so suddenly and without explanation had left everyone on edge. For the first time in years, people were locking their doors at night. Suspicious glances were exchanged between neighbors, and the sense of security that had once defined Bergsville was eroding. The media attention had died down somewhat, but the case was still the main topic of conversation in town. The more time passed, the more theories began to circulate. Some believed Jessica had run away, overwhelmed by something in her life. Others whispered about the possibility of a stalker, but no one knew for sure. Detective Graham, however, was certain that Jessica hadn't left on her own. He was convinced that she had uncovered something dangerous, and that someone had taken her to keep her quiet. Just when it seemed that the investigation had hit another dead end, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A group of hikers in the woods on the outskirts of Bergsville stumbled upon something that would change the course of the investigation. A set of clothes, folded neatly and placed under a tree. The clothes matched the description of what Jessica had been wearing the night she disappeared. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was the first tangible evidence they had found in weeks. The location where the clothes were found was remote, far from where Jessica's car had been parked, and it was clear that someone had intentionally placed them there. The clothes were sent to the lab for analysis, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no fingerprints. It was as if someone had carefully removed them and left them behind as a message. But what was that message? And why now? Graham's mind raced. Could this be a warning? Or was it a sign that whoever had taken Jessica was still watching, still in control? The discovery of the clothes added a new layer of mystery to the case, but it also renewed Graham's determination to find her. As the days stretched into weeks, Bergsville found itself at the center of a mystery that no one could have anticipated. What had once been a town known for its simplicity and charm was now gripped by fear. Jessica's disappearance, once a source of collective determination and hope, had slowly become a weight that hung over the town like a dark cloud. People started avoiding conversations about her. Parents held their children closer. The friendly banter that once echoed through the diner was replaced by whispers and nervous glances. For Jessica's parents, Mary and John, the situation had become unbearable. Mary had taken to walking the streets late at night, placing missing person flyers on lampposts and store windows, despite the fact that the town was already plastered with them. John, on the other hand, had become withdrawn, spending his days in a silent haze, staring at Jessica's photographs, unable to reconcile the growing fear in his heart with the man who was supposed to protect his family. Despite the growing fear in town, Detective Graham was more determined than ever. The discovery of Jessica's clothes had reignited the investigation. Something about the way the clothes were folded so carefully, so deliberately, told him that whoever was behind this was playing a game. The person responsible wasn't just interested in taking Jessica, they wanted to send a message. The problem was that Graham wasn't sure what that message was yet. With new energy, Graham dove deeper into the investigation, focusing on the connections between the missing funds at the bank and the man at the center of his suspicions, Rick Lawson. He spent hours going over the financial records, tracing the money from account to account, trying to find the thread that would link it all together. Graham's theory was growing stronger by the day. Jessica had uncovered the truth about the money laundering scheme at the bank, and someone had found out. That someone was likely Rick Lawson, who had ties to criminal elements involved in illegal financial activities. Lawson's account had been flagged in the same internal investigation that Jessica had been involved in, and the timing of her disappearance was too much of a coincidence to ignore. But there was one piece missing, the person above Lawson, the mastermind behind it all. Graham knew that Lawson was just a pawn in a much larger game, but without more evidence, he couldn't prove it. And with each passing day, he worried that Jessica's time was running out. Then, one night, a break came in the most unexpected way. Detective Graham was sitting in his office, reviewing case files late into the night, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was distorted, likely through some kind of voice-altering device. But what they said made Graham's blood run cold. "I know where Jessica is," the voice whispered. "If you want to find her, you'll come alone." Graham tried to keep the caller on the line, asking questions, but the voice simply repeated the instructions. "Come alone. I'll give you more details soon." Before Graham could respond, the line went dead. Graham knew he couldn't ignore the call. It was the first lead they had in weeks, but he also knew it was a trap. Whoever was behind Jessica's disappearance had been toying with him from the start, and this was just another move in their game. But if there was even a small chance that he could find Jessica, he had to take it. He prepared carefully, deciding not to inform the rest of the team. This was too risky. If the caller suspected that Graham had brought back up, they might panic and harm Jessica. He couldn't take that chance. The call came an hour later. The instructions were simple. Drive to a specific location outside of town, far into the countryside where no one would hear or see anything. Graham followed the directions, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he couldn't turn back now. The road grew narrower, and soon Graham found himself driving through thick woods. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense trees, and the sound of rain against his windshield added to the tension. He reached the designated spot, a remote cabin deep in the forest. The cabin looked abandoned, its windows dark, and the only sound was the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. Graham stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his sidearm. He approached the cabin cautiously, every instinct telling him to turn back. But as he reached the door, he noticed something. A small envelope taped to the front. Inside was a photograph of Jessica, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with fear. Before Graham could process what he was seeing, the door to the cabin creaked open. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, their face obscured by the darkness. "Where is she?" Graham demanded, his voice low but filled with anger. The figure remained silent for a moment before stepping out of the shadows. It was Rick Lawson. "You're in way over your head, detective," Lawson sneered. "You don't understand what's really going on here." "I understand enough," Graham replied, his hand inching toward his gun. "Where is Jessica?" Lawson smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Jessica found something she shouldn't have. She dug too deep, and now, well, she's part of the problem." Before Graham could react, Lawson bolted back into the cabin. Graham chased after him, drawing his weapon as he entered the darkened interior. The cabin was sparse, barely furnished with only a few chairs and a table, but the air was thick with tension. Suddenly, a shot rang out, narrowly missing Graham as he ducked behind a wall. Lawson was armed, and he wasn't going down without a fight. But Graham had no intention of letting him escape this time. The firefight was brief but intense. Graham, using his training and instincts, managed to outmaneuver Lawson, disarming him in a matter of seconds. Lawson lay on the floor, clutching his wounded arm, his face twisted in pain. "You're going to tell me everything?" Graham said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Where is Jessica?" Lawson laughed weakly. "It's not that simple," he said through gritted teeth. "You think I'm the one pulling the strings? You think I'm the one who made her disappear?" Graham's heart sank. Lawson wasn't working alone. "There are people, powerful people. They wanted her gone," Lawson continued. "She found something in those records, something bigger than just missing money. If you want to find her, you'll have to take them down." Before Graham could press him further, sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was arriving, but it was too late for Lawson. He had given Graham just enough information to point him in the right direction, but not enough to save Jessica. As Lawson was taken into custody, Graham knew the case was far from over. He had uncovered the tip of the iceberg, but the real players were still out there. Whoever was behind the money laundering scheme and Jessica's disappearance was more powerful and dangerous than he had imagined. But Graham wasn't going to stop. He had come too far, and Jessica's life was still on the line. The next phase of the investigation was about to begin, and Graham was more determined than ever. He would find Jessica. He would bring her home. Back at the station, Graham sat alone in his office, the weight of the case pressing down on him. Despite having Rick Lawson in custody, Jessica was still missing, and it was clear that Lawson was just a cog in a much larger machine. The money laundering scheme Jessica had uncovered was connected to something far more dangerous. The people involved were powerful, connected, and ruthless. They had eyes everywhere, and they weren't just laundering money. They were willing to kill to keep their operation running smoothly. Graham had pieced together as much as he could. The offshore accounts, the missing funds, the sudden appearance of Lawson. None of it was a coincidence. But there was still a critical piece missing: the identity of the person or people behind it all. Lawson had hinted at higher-ups, people who had more to lose than he did. Whoever they were, they had orchestrated Jessica's disappearance to protect their interests. As Graham continued to dig, he received another unexpected call. This time, the voice on the other end was calm and controlled. Clearly someone who wasn't afraid. "Detective Graham," the voice said smoothly, "I see you've been busy. I'll give you credit for getting this far. But if you want to keep your little town safe, you'll stop now." Graham's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled softly. "You know who we are. Jessica's disappearance? That's just the beginning. You don't want to dig too deep, detective. Some things are better left buried." The line went dead before Graham could respond. He sat in silence for a moment, the realization sinking in. This wasn't just about Jessica anymore. The people behind this operation were watching him, and they weren't afraid to use threats to get him to back off. While Graham worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, Jessica was fighting her own battle. She had been held captive for what felt like an eternity, though she had lost track of the days. The room where she was kept was small, dark, and cold. There were no windows, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Her captors rarely spoke to her, only coming in to give her food or water, which was minimal. At first, she had been terrified. She had no idea why she had been taken or who was behind it. But over time, she began to piece things together. The overheard conversations, the way they spoke about her as if she were just another problem to be handled. It all pointed to the money laundering operation she had uncovered at the bank. She had been right all along. Someone had noticed her digging through the accounts, and they had decided to make her disappear before she could expose them. But Jessica wasn't ready to give up. She had fought hard to stay calm, to observe her surroundings, and to look for any opportunity to escape. She knew that if she stayed quiet and kept her eyes open, she might find a way out. She just needed time. Graham's investigation was getting closer to the truth, but it was also putting him in greater danger. The people running the money laundering operation were not the type to sit back and let a small-town detective ruin their plans. They had connections, high-level connections, and they were watching every move Graham made. As Graham continued his work, he began noticing small but unsettling things. A car parked across the street from his home for hours at a time. A stranger lingering in the lobby of the police station. It was clear that the organization was sending him a message. Back off or face the consequences. But Graham wasn't easily intimidated. He knew that if he stopped now, Jessica would be lost forever. He couldn't let that happen. He needed to find out who was pulling the strings, and he was willing to risk everything to do it. He doubled down on his efforts, working late into the night, cross-referencing financial records, interviewing anyone who had any connection to the bank or Lawson. His persistence paid off. Through a series of complex financial trails, he discovered a name. A powerful figure in the world of finance. Someone who had been using the bank as a front for illegal activities for years. This person wasn't just involved in the money laundering operation. They were running it. The discovery of the name was a turning point in the investigation, but it also put a target on Graham's back. He had uncovered the identity of the person behind Jessica's disappearance, but now he had to move quickly. The organization wasn't going to let him go after one of their own without a fight. Graham knew he had to act fast. He reached out to a trusted contact in the FBI, someone who had experience with large-scale financial crimes. Together, they began planning how to take down the organization once and for all. But as they prepared, Graham received another call. This time, it wasn't a threat, it was a tip. An anonymous source told Graham that Jessica was being held at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, but sincere. "You have to hurry," the caller said. "They're planning to move her soon." Graham didn't waste a second. He grabbed his gun, called for backup, and raced to the location. He knew this could be his only chance to find Jessica before it was too late. The warehouse was large, with broken windows and rusted metal doors. It had clearly been abandoned for years, but tonight, it was the center of a massive operation. Graham and his team approached cautiously, knowing that whoever was inside wouldn't go down without a fight. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Graham could hear voices, low, urgent whispers. He signaled to his team, and within seconds they stormed the building. Chaos erupted. Armed men rushed to defend the space, but they were no match for the police. Within minutes, most of them were subdued. Graham moved quickly through the maze of corridors, searching desperately for any sign of Jessica. Finally, in a small room at the back of the warehouse, he found her. She was bound but alive. The relief that flooded through him was overwhelming. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. As Graham helped Jessica to her feet, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. The mastermind behind the operation had arrived, and they weren't going down without a fight. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, revealing a face that Graham had only seen in photographs. Alexander Trask, the financier who had orchestrated the entire scheme. Trask had built his empire on a foundation of illegal activities, and Jessica's discovery of the money laundering operation had put it all at risk. "You really don't know when to stop, do you, detective?" Trask said, his voice calm, almost amused. Graham stepped in front of Jessica, shielding her from Trask. "It's over, Trask. You're finished." Trask smiled, a cold, ruthless smile. "I don't think so. You might have found her, but you've already lost." He raised his hand, signaling to the remaining men behind him. What followed was a tense and violent confrontation. Trask's men were well-armed and prepared to defend their leader at all costs, but Graham's team was determined to bring Jessica home. The fight was brutal, but in the end, Graham's team prevailed. Trask was arrested, along with the remaining members of his operation. As the dust settled, Graham turned to Jessica. She was safe. After weeks of uncertainty, fear, and pain, she was finally free. In the days that followed, the full extent of the money laundering operation was revealed. Trask's empire had been built on a web of corruption and crime, and it had taken Jessica's discovery to bring it all down. The town of Bergsville slowly began to recover from the ordeal, though the scars would take time to heal. Jessica's parents were overjoyed to have her back, though the trauma of what she had endured would take time to fade. For Graham, the case had been the most challenging of his career, but it had also been the most rewarding. He had saved a life and brought a powerful criminal to justice. Bergsville would never be the same, but the darkness that had briefly taken hold of the town had finally been defeated.